Hello and welcome to this episode of Catching the Octopus podcast. Today I'm talking about representation, and you've probably heard the saying, you can't be what you can't see. And it's usually a phrase that's used around things when we're talking about diversity and inclusion. And things like seeing women become pilots and doctors, and seeing people that possibly have disabilities being represented in the media or in movies, and seeing Indigenous languages being celebrated instead of forgotten. All those sorts of things. And this is really super important because it's not just on the surface, right? I want to go a bit deeper with this today in this episode, because representation isn't only what inspires us. It's also about who we reward, who we platform, who we forgive, and who we continue to celebrate despite their behaviour, right? So every person that we elevate, that we give a voice, that we give a platform, that sends a message. And that can be done through different news headlines, viral videos, elections, when someone receives a standing ovation. There can be contracts that they might be given, whether that's big corporate contracts or sporting contracts or music contracts, whenever they're seen on television or whether they're seen in a media space. And so whether we like it or not, every time something is platformed, it's communicating something about what our society values. And perhaps even more importantly, it's basically what teaches our children what success looks like. So for someone that is being platformed for viral behavior, then that is seen to be as, okay, well, if I display that behavior, that is what is available to me. There are times where people of really good characters are platformed, are elevated, but it's not happening as much as the ones that aren't great people, right? And so we're limiting in that space the representation of people being good humans, of showing up with morals and values and those sorts of things. There's, a mayor in America at the moment, the New York mayor, who is doing some great things. And that's probably offhand, you may have more that you can think of, but that offhand is probably the only example I can see of someone that's getting attention on social media, in other media platforms, and being able to represent what it's like to do the right thing by community and to be a decent human being in the way that we operate, listening, getting feedback, listening to that feedback, making positive change, trying to create community where everyone feels welcomed and everyone can benefit. Getting resources from those that are well resourced and redistributing those in more of a social aspect so that we all can win. And so we learn through observation, right? Psychology has taught us for decades that human beings learn through observation. And we can, if you're a parent, you can relate to this. We can tell our children a million times what needs to be done or how they need to be and what is right, but they're watching, right? They're watching us. They're watching what they see in cartoons or on social or on video, on platforms. Sorry, I'm getting a bit confused, but on tablets, YouTube, kids, whatever they're watching, right? They watch, they notice, they absorb, and then they repeat those behaviors. And so if a child repeatedly sees women only represented as caregivers, right, they then begin forming beliefs about what women should become. So whether they are a young girl, then they will think that, okay, that's all that's available to me, and maybe feel out of place if they want to pursue something different. If they are a little boy, then they're probably going to look at that and go, okay, well, that's what's going to happen with girls, and probably feel uncomfortable when they see women doing things outside of that norm. If they repeatedly see men portrayed as emotionally unavailable or aggressive or working all the time and not being with the family, those ideas begin to feel normal too, right? And have those same responses, because what we view and what we watch and what we notice, we absorb. And then that same thing applies to race, disability, sexuality, leadership, Kindness. So the more kindness we see, the more we believe or feel or absorb that kindness is something we need to do. Even power, positions of power. If we see power as ways that we can actually help raise up those that don't have as much privilege of us, then we're going to view power to be that. If we're absorbing that power is about controlling other people, putting people down, burning people out, taking and not sharing and giving, then that is what we're going to associate our desire of power to be. So representation itself isn't simply about inclusion, right? It creates expectations and it creates or limits possibilities for what our brain will actually process as what we can do or what we can't do or what is normal and what is not normal. And so, as I mentioned, there's a lot of power, positive power in that representation when it's done right. And we've made so much progress. If you look back many, many years ago in movies, instead of actually hiring people that were black, they would blackface themselves, right? So it's still white people doing those roles. And so the traditional sense of how people show up in all of these different spaces we see is shifting. And we've made enormous progress in that. And one example that I absolutely love is Bluey. So not only has Bluey become one of the greatest Australian cultural exports, right? It's loved all around the world, but episodes have also been dubbed in Aboriginal language. So think for a moment about what that communicates, right? So for Aboriginal children, it says your language matters, your culture belongs, your identity deserves to be celebrated, right? And for everyone else, that just normalizes Indigenous languages as part of modern Australia and not confining it to something that's just in the history books or something from the past. Like it's now. And when we can actually normalize that and celebrate that, then we're more open to accepting that in our day to day. You know, that matters. Another positive example is Barbie. You know, years ago, Barbie represented one very narrow version of beauty and success. But today, you can find Barbie as a doctor. You can find astronaut, pilot, engineer Barbie, sorry, a firefighter. There's even a Barbie that uses a wheelchair. Down syndrome Barbie. There's different body shape Barbies. There's different skin colors and cultures. And the message has really changed from this is what girls should look like to this is what girls can become. And that's representation that changes lives, right? Not because every little girl wants to become Barbie, but because possibilities expand. And that's incredibly powerful. And so the more positive representation we can have, the more we're expanding the potential and possibilities of what we think is possible for us. What we see, we can become, right? And so, unfortunately, though, in a world that is created with a lot of hierarchical systems and a lot of capitalist structures, representation isn't always positive, right? Because there is danger in a world that is empowered to think that we can do whatever we want to do. So having the illusion we can do whatever we want to do then allows a few to jump through that glass ceiling to keep that illusion alive. But realistically, the representation that isn't positive kind of keeps people in the box and keeps a position of destabilization, right? And here's where I don't think we spend enough time, because I know when I look at representation, I think of the positive. I'm wired like that. But that's not the way the world is. And representation works both ways. And so if positive representation can normalize those things like kindness and inclusion and possibility and cultural values, then negative representation can normalize the opposite of that. It can normalize things like hatred and violence. It's normalizing things like racism. There's normalization of misogyny and dishonesty, cruelty, and not because everyone watching it then becomes hateful or becomes a misogynist or becomes dishonest or becomes a rapist or anything like that. It's because repeated exposure that slowly shifts what we feel is acceptable. And so there's no shock value anymore because of the representation that's out there of these poor, poor behaviors. There's no shock value anymore from anyone that goes, clutching my pearls. What did they do? And then they are cancelled, or everyone goes against them, or the community just feels like that's unacceptable. So, what it is it's desensitizing us so that when we see that, we go, oh, yeah, I'm not surprised, right? And unfortunately, that's the case. That's also the case with a lot of behaviors around men, right? I know that there's some great men out there, but there's a lot more that are bad guys, good guys, nice guys, that when they behave in a particular way, people will go, that's disgusting, but not surprising. Right. And so this representation now is normalizing that this is something that there's no reason to get shocked about it. There's no reason to get upset about it. And that is scary. That's where the problem is, because then there's just a few people that do feel the passion and they do have the voice and they do speak up, but then society brands them as too much or too loud or too disruptive, or they're, just got to be in their bonnet or whatever it is to discredit their voice. And then it just creates an echo chamber for this really poor behavior being normalized and accepted. And so think about now, who are the people that continue to receive these enormous platforms despite, their behavior that would probably end the career of almost anyone else? Athletes. We had one recently, a fighter that is a rapist that got platformed majorly. And I don't have exact data, and so you're most welcome to fact check me, but I believe that the betting on that fight actually was a record. It exceeded betting on any other fight before. How's that for representation, right? How's that for normalizing those kinds of people in our society? Think about musicians. I know there's definitely some musicians that have a list as long as their arm of assault and battery charges. And even we've seen the photos of their partners that they've assaulted. Right? Yet still they're worth millions and millions of dollars, right? And they've got all of these contracts and people keep buying their music. There's actors as well that fall into this category. Some of them are prosecuted, but a lot of them just walk around still earning their big bucks, still getting cast for different movies. People still watch the movies, right? There's public figures as well. If you look at politicians and influencers and all those sorts of things that are terrible, terrible people, namely one that I can think of who is a pedophile and a rapist, yet people are defending the behavior. Right? And they can get voted in as a leader of a major country in the world, right? Like one of the big, powerful countries in the world. They're running it. That's representation, right? And so sometimes we celebrate these people because they're talented or because they are classified as business people or for whatever reason, right? And people then go, oh, you've got to separate the behaviors from the craft or from the art. But why? Why are we doing that? The only reason we go doing that is so that they can make more money, right? And in my opinion, sometimes that talent seems to outweigh the serious concerns around their conduct. And that's really concerning because in those spaces, what message does that send, right? Perhaps not that harmful behavior is acceptable, but maybe success matters more than character. Yeah, have a think about that. It's not that we're actually upset about the behavior because obviously we're thinking that their success is more important than actually calling out that behavior and actually taking steps to show that that behavior was not acceptable. And that's a really different lesson and different thing that we're showcasing, especially the next generation coming through, right? And it's one worth really thinking about in the way that representation is working around the space. Now, we see this sort of stuff in politics as well, these patterns. In Australia, we have a politician at the moment who has been around, actually, been quite prominent in the scene for many, many years. And the messaging coming from them is around immigration and national identity and social issues. But they've they've created a really strong attachment and support from many Australians, right? While others, though, see many of her statements as divisive and inflammatory, harmful, racist, all of those sorts of things. And whether you disagree with her or you agree with her really isn't the point in what I'm making today. The question really is, what happens when language that once sat on the fringe, right, that wasn't part of the mainstream, that wasn't deemed to be acceptable, now becomes part of everyday conversation? Because language shapes culture. Right. And so when public figures are out there repeatedly using rhetoric that divides people into an us and them and makes us look at our fellow species as different because of the way that we present in our skin color or where we're born or what our cultural background is, it can make those ways of thinking feel more acceptable to be able to express on a public forum. And I would like to think, and I would hope, everyone that supports politicians like this aren't racist. However, there might be, let me step back, there might be many people that are motivated by the concerns about cost of living or housing or the trust around other governments, government entities and groups, and those major parties may be feeling unheard from them. However, and although those concerns are real, right? I'm just trying to think of the way. However, a lot of the messaging that comes out is misinformation. It is manipulated to get people riled up, to get people angry, right? And so if those are the issues we're talking about, cost of living, housing, government trust, those sorts of things, that really needs or deserves to be discussed respectfully, right? So the oversimplification of complex issues or presenting selective information in ways that incite or strongly appeal to people's emotions, that's creating a whole different aspect, because when people feel anxious or frustrated or left behind, then they're often more receptive to messages that promise those simple explanations, right? Or looking for someone to blame. I need someone to blame for this. And so history shows us that the periods of economic uncertainty and declining trust in any institution, right, and especially within governments and countries and stuff like that, that creates a bit of fertile ground for these more populist political movements. And although I try hard to be accepting of the supporters and see it from a different perspective, right? Because when I see someone that is supporting someone that has these views, has misinformation, just creating division, like can't even become prime minister, right? Because they don't have the structures within our government system to do it, yet banging on about becoming prime minister. Grifting, putting out, asking for money from people, and then seeing people in my sphere actually sharing it out and donating money when they have billionaire benefactors, all the things I could keep going, right? So although I see all that, I do tell myself from time to time as well that sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And it also reminds me that, the fear and uncertainty and frustration, they're really super powerful emotions, and they're being used as political tools. And some people aren't as aware as others, and some people can get drawn in to that focal point and maybe do things that don't quite align with their values. And so I need to think that some of these people maybe do have values, right? Because it's a really tricky space for me. But anyway, that's not what this podcast episode's about. So let's keep shifting on. And so when we're looking at the platforming of these individuals as well, whether they're a sports person, whether they're a politician, whether they're a musician, wherever they are, not only do they get platformed on big stages as well, like, tonight shows and those sorts of things, which is really frustrating and upsetting. They're also platformed within algorithms, right, on social media. So we do have instances of with one particular election for a country a couple of years back where the owners of the social media platforms actually commented saying that they helped this person come into power because they were able to manipulate the algorithms to be able to showcase what they needed to showcase to get the support, to get the voters, right? And so there's that element of it being curated, but also when we're looking at the algorithm space, there's, algorithms don't care what's true and they don't care what's kind. So when the algorithm's looking through posts, they don't look at it and go, oh, here's an ethical post, I'm going to post that. Or this has misinformation, I'm going to actually push that down in the algorithm, right? What they care about is what gets engagement and what keeps you watching or what keeps you scrolling and connecting and commenting and clicking and all of those sorts of things. So those posts that come out that have aspects in them that incite outrage and fear and conflict, they work, right? Extreme opinions, they work. And so that's exactly what's getting amplified. So let me give you this example, right? If I walked into a stadium, a sports stadium, say there's 50,000 people in the sports stadium, but there's only 500 of them that are screaming abuse and yelling out profanities, right? I'd know by walking into that stadium that that 500 were a minority. I'd hear them, I'd see them, but I'd also see the other, 49,500 people. And so I would know that they're a minority group. But online, it's different, right? Those same 500 voices, they can be amplified. So those algorithms can amplify them. They can be boosted by bots. So a lot of the comments that come in there are actually from bots. And so they're designed to create contentious platforming for people to comment on and engage on, because then that engages the algorithm more, right? They can be shared thousands of times by the 500 people, whereas the other people may not be sharing stuff. They're commented on endlessly. And so when we see something come up in our social media feeds, it can kind of sometimes feel like it's everyone. Like everyone has these views. And suddenly it appears that hate is everywhere. I know on one of the platforms that I post on, I spend some time on there after I've posted, and I very rarely get any posts or updates from my friends on that platform. But what I do get is so much misogyny, hate, racism, red pill content, and I don't even engage in those posts, right? But they're appearing on my feed because they have been engaged in and they're being pushed by the algorithm, whether they're being pushed by the structure and intent of algorithms or whether they're just being pushed purely through the bot's engagement and everyone else's engagement, doesn't matter. It's in that space. And so it can be put us in the space where we think that everyone thinks that way, right? But they don't. And this is where our voices need to become coming up, because we're simply seeing in this space a lot of amplification. It's not necessarily representation, but it's being viewed by us as representation because we know no different. I know there's people out there that probably don't believe in bots, that think that everyone comments on a post is someone commenting on a post. There's some stats, again, I don't have the exact figures. Please feel free to fact check me. But they're talking about 40% on some posts are bots. That's a lot of fake comments that are just trying to incite engagement, right? And so knowing that it's amplification, not necessarily representation, is really important, because for those that do have the kindness, for those that do want to help those that are less privileged than themselves, for those that see everyone as the one human species and don't want to segregate people due to the color of their skin or the language they use or where they were born, for those people, sometimes they're hesitant about speaking out because they feel like they're the minority, right? But when good people become quiet, that's where the danger sits, right? Because then us decent people start, believing that we're alone, and we stop speaking We read the comments, we see the outrage. Maybe you've experienced this yourself and you think, oh, maybe I'm the only one that feels differently. And it creates that feeling of isolation. Because of that, if you look at social psychology, there's a lot of experiments that show that we want to fit in with the group. One of them, you can probably Google it. I use it in some of my training, is a social experiment. It's not a clinical experiment, so there's not strong controls in place, but they have a clinic and they have actors in there that go stand up when there's a beep and sit down afterwards. And so someone new comes in that's not an actor and they stand up and then sit down as well. And then eventually the actors leave the room and the room is just filled with people that aren't actors and they're all doing the same thing. When a beep goes off, they stand up. Towards the end, there's actually one gentleman that kind of fights it a couple of times and you can see him going, I'm not going to do this. This is silly. And then towards the end, he just lifts his butt up and sits down, right? So even he was driven to do that. So these people that are pushing this agenda of amplifying misogyny, of normalizing rape and assault and vile behavior, racism, all of those sorts of things, they know this, right? And that's why they saturate with so much content. And so by seeing that and thinking, oh, I can't comment because I'm the minority here, right? I'm the only one that thinks differently. We stay silent. And then when we stay silent, someone else stay silent. And then someone else stays silent. And so before long, we're living in this space where those real loud voices, they're the ones that are dominating. And not because they're the majority, no, but because everyone else has stepped back, right? And so this psychologists actually call this a spiral of silence, right? Because people become less willing to express their views when they believe they're the minority, even when they're not the minority, right? So, and that silence creates the illusion of agreement. And so when we have silence and when we're not actually standing up against this, then that is another step of normalizing that kind of behavior. So even if I feel outraged and disgusted by this, I'm kind of like, oh, I'm not surprised. And I go on with my day. And that is setting up society for more of a rape culture, of a violence culture, of pedophilia, right? Being normalized, unfortunately. And it's a really sad state of affairs, but this is where we're shifting. And this is the danger of the way that the algorithms are working at the moment, because they're influencing full societies, right? So what can we do? We can become intentional, right? My suggestion as well would be ask yourself, who am I giving my attention to? So looking within yourself and thinking about, who am I sharing? Like, who am I platforming? Who am I spending money in their business? Who am I supporting in that space? Who am I rewarding with my time and my focus? Who am I making famous? Who am I talking about? Even though I talk about a lot of people, I try not to use their particular names because I don't want I don't want to give them any more energy, right? I want to talk about their behaviors, not them. I don't want to platform them as people, because attention is pretty much the most valuable currency we have. So every time you buy something, every time you subscribe to something, every click, every share, every outrage comment, even if you're going against what they're saying, every replay of a video, right? That tells the algorithm that you want to see more of that. And not only does it tell the algorithm, show me more, it then says to the algorithm, you need to show this to everyone else more too, because this is a really popular thing. This is getting engagement. And so we choose to be invisible. And we do that to model kindness. We do that because we want to model all of those really good things, right? But we also need to stay in a space of being curious, living in that curiosity aspect, showing respect, getting into a critical thinking space. And we don't need to really shout louder than everyone else. We simply probably need to just be enough and need enough good people that are willing to be seen. So, in closing, I suppose representation has never been more important than it is today, especially with what we have in the form of representation and how that's shifting us to live in a world that is impacting the safety. It's impacting the safety of me as a woman. It's impacting the safety of girls, and my daughter included. It's impacting the safety of people that have a different skin color. It's impacting the safety of, you know, those that are born in a different country, because exclusion and violence and hate isn't anywhere where you're going to feel safe. Right. And while we've actually got these people in these big positions as well, platforming themselves, making money off of us, then that's affecting our economic standing as well. Right. And so we can throw billionaires into the mix in this as well, while you're still buying their products or supporting their platforms or helping them out financially. You're building their wealth. They're not giving it back to you, right? They're just going and on building and using your wealth as a platform to build more for themselves. And so that's creating a lot of strain on, you know, the everyday person financially. That's causing inflation in everyday items around us economically, but not in our wages, right? Because the currency, the money that needs to go around, is being hoarded in one particular space. And so having a think about the representation, how important it is, and not because everyone deserves to see themselves reflected in the world. Like, that would be ideally a beautiful place where everyone got to see themselves reflected in the world around them. But even on top of that, you know, every person we elevate becomes part of our collective definition of success. Our children are watching. Your friends are watching what you do. Our friends are watching. Communities are watching. And from that, they're learning who gets rewarded. They're learning who gets forgiven or just, you know, not considered. Their behaviors, it's their art form that's more important than their behaviors and their character. They're looking and learning about who gets celebrated. And so if I want to be someone that elevates myself, do I have to be unethical and have no morals and have no values? Because around me, that's what's getting celebrated, right? Is that what we want to incite in our community? We're also learning who gets ignored, who gets told that they're crazy or too outspoken or aggressive, when their aggressive behavior is just it's not even aggressive behavior, it's passion, but we'll label it as aggressive, right? So that their voice is diminished or minimized. So in this space, I suppose that perhaps the question is, who represents, well, sorry, perhaps the question isn't who represents me. Maybe we could ask a better question. Maybe that question is, what kind of society am I helping to represent? So if you think of yourself and you think of what you've clicked on, what you've shared, what you've commented on, what you've done in the past week on social media, on the purchases that you've made, have you purchased from these big players that are pushing out the little guys, or have you gone local and bought things from little local suppliers? Like, what behaviors have you done in the last week? And is that what you would like to represent, right? What kind of society are you helping to represent? Because representation isn't just about what we see, it's more about who we choose to become. Anyway, I hope that this episode resonated with you, and feel free to share this with anyone else if you think that they might get some value as well out of the conversation. And I hope that if you did get value out of this episode, that I can share more value with you in our next episode.